Hey, fourth graders, it's me, Mr. B again, in virtual mode. Oh, there are Lucy and Tumnus. Looks like they want to be in this video. And we're back with more from Lost in the Antarctic. This is Chapter 4, Fast in the Ice. On January 19th, the morning after Lees started getting ready to land, the entire crew woke to a grim sight. The ice had closed tight against the sides of the ship. Worsley climbed into the crow's nest, hoping to find a way out. "No water in sight from the deck," he wrote that night. "Very little from masthead, and dull, gloomy pall over the sky since noon." The carpenter, McNish, who wasn't one to waste words, started keeping track of their progress in his diary. Thursday the 21st. We are still fast in the ice. Friday, the 22nd, still in the same predicament with no signs of any change. Saturday, 23rd, still fast. Sunday, 24th, still fast and no signs of any opening pressure. Monday, 25th, still fast. That's not to say the Endurance wasn't moving. The pack ice in the Weddell Sea swirls clockwise like a giant pinwheel, 1,000 miles across. The ship and her 28 human occupants had become part of the pack, and they drifted with it to the southwest. By February 1st, they could almost see their goal. Vassal Bay was just 59 miles away. It might as well have been halfway across the earth. The ice between the ship and the coast was uneven and riddled with cracks. One man on skis would be hard-pressed to make the trip without plunging into 30-degree water. Hauling tons of supplies by sled was out of the question. No one was willing to admit that they were stuck for good, but their prospects looked bad. They needed warm temperatures and a stiff south wind to break up the pack. Instead, the wind died completely, and the temperature dropped below zero. By the second week, they ran out of seal meat, and Lees started hoarding the canned food. "I grudge every tin of meat now," he wrote. With no sailing to keep them occupied, the men started to get restless. On Saturday nights, Shackleton let the crew gather in the wardroom, sing, and drink a toast to sweethearts and wives. The second Saturday in the ice, McNish drank more than his share and got into a fight in the forecastle. Spelled forecastle, pronounced forecastle. A few days later, Lees and McNish were battling over Lee's beloved storeroom. McNish thought Lees spent all his time fussing around and never did any useful work. So as soon as Lees got everything organized just right, McNish would come looking for something and leave the room a mess. "He has an exceptionally offensive manner, and it is very hard to be patient with him," Lees huffed. Shackleton had picked crew members he thought would get along with each other, but McNish was the one man he didn't trust. Every day, while the crew tried to keep busy, Shackleton and Worsley climbed the mast to scan for open leads. The light and the endless expanse of white often played tricks on their eyes. Clouds looked like icebergs, and icebergs dangled upside down from the sky. Worst of all, if the angle of light was just right, a streak of open water appeared in the distance. If they squinted long enough, they realized it was an illusion. On February 5th, the ice shifted and the ship settled into open water with a sharp jolt. Everyone rushed on deck to see if they'd been liberated, but they were stuck in a small pool surrounded by ice. That night, the water around them froze solid again. On Valentine's Day, Shackleton called all hands together. The winds had been blowing again from the southwest. The pack seemed to be loosening. From the masthead, open water appeared a third of a mile off, and this time it wasn't a mirage. They were going to make one final attempt to get free. The crew climbed onto the floe to battle the ice. 24 men hacked away near the bow of the ship with pickaxes, giant ice saws, and 10-foot-tall iron poles. They carved the ice into blocks and hauled them aside. It was exhausting work, but eventually they gave the Endurance 10 feet of open water. With Lees at the wheel, Worsley rammed a thick, lumpy section of the pack again and again. The men moved ahead and worked on the young ice beyond the lump. All day they chipped and sawed and hauled with the temperature hovering around 10 degrees. By midnight, the men were soaked and chilled to the bone. They had opened a hole the size of half a tennis court. By 4 p.m. the next day, a day and a half of labor had moved the ship 200 yards. Between the Endurance and the open water lay 400 more yards of 10-foot thick ice, and the water was freezing up as fast as they could clear it. Shackleton called off the effort. And there they are, carving a channel in the ice. The order came as no surprise. It would have been hard to find a single person on board who thought they had a chance in the first place. Puny mortals striving frantically against the mighty forces of nature, Lees wrote, the laughing stock of the gods, only a handful of us contending against all that ice. But gone for the moment were the restlessness and the petty squabbles. I never saw such unanimous cooperation and intensity of purpose, Lees concluded. And that was probably the point to begin with. Shackleton knew that grumbling started when there was nothing to do. He also knew that in the months ahead, these men were going to need to work together. This was a training session. That night, the sun dipped below the horizon for the first time in 3.5 months. The days would shorten fast. In April or May, the sun would vanish for several more long, dark months. Winter was on its way, and the crew of the Endurance would spend it trapped in the ice. On February 24th, Shackleton ordered an end to normal ship duties. He put all hands to work storing seal meat and moving supplies out of the cargo hold below. With a little work, the hold, sheltered from the wind and the cold, would become their winter quarters. Today, we practically cease being a ship and become a winter station, Worsley recorded. For now, they had food. They could melt snow and ice for drinking water. Maybe in a few months, the ice would loosen. Maybe the giant rotating pack would carry them far enough north to find open water. Then they could resupply in South America and try to make their way back to Vassal Bay. In the meantime, the ship would be their only shelter from temperatures cold enough to freeze tears on a man's face. But who could say for sure how long it would survive? We will have to wait God's will to get out, McNish wrote. Temperature, +2. Chapter 5. Wintering. Isolated from the world and trapped for the winter, the men felt a gloom settle over the ship. A wave of depression seemed to come over everybody on board, wrote James Wordie, the geologist. It was soon noticed that it was best not to get in the boss's way. But while the men sensed Shackleton's anxiety, the boss didn't show it openly. He explained calmly that they would spend the winter in the pack. Then he put the men to work. The first task was to build winter quarters, and the crew weren't the only ones in need. Worsley spent the first week of March supervising a team of doghouse builders out on the ice. The team sawed blocks of ice from the floe and stacked them into round walls for tiny huts. They used boards or sealskin for the roofs. Then they packed snow on top and poured water over the huts to freeze them into place. By March 5th, a ring of icy doghouses surrounded the ship. The sailors called their masterpieces dogloos. While the dogloo builders did their work, McNish built a home below decks for most of the officers and the scientists. He made cubicles in the empty hold and put bunks in each one. A table occupied the middle of the room. A pot-bellied stove stood in the corner. The sailors would stay in the forecastle, where they always slept. Shackleton would sleep in his drafty cabin on the deck. Like kids moving into a cabin at camp, Lees, Hurley, Hussey, and the rest set up their quarters. They gave their cubicles names, and Hurley carved little wooden plaques for each one. Pictures of loved ones went up near the bunks. The roommates called their private hideaway the Ritz, after the most luxurious hotel in London. And there's that picture of the Endurance with the dog loose. The only thing more important than shelter was food. That became only too clear to the seals and penguins that came to investigate the intruders in their midst. It was Worsley's job to stand on the masthead with a telescope and binoculars, scanning the ice for life. When he saw movement, he called out directions to a party of hunters through a megaphone. Frank Wild often led the hunting parties, pistol in hand. They went out on skis or by dog sled. If everything went according to plan, Wild dispatched his prey with one shot to the head. But sometimes the hunt turned into a brutal slaughter. Lees and Worsley once wounded a seal, but ran out of ammunition before they could kill it. They finished the job by clubbing the maimed animal to death with an oar. According to Worsley, it was an awful, bloody business. But the men had a feeling that at any moment the hunters could become the hunted. They had seen killer whales stalk seals or penguins under young ice. When the 10,000-pound predators saw their chance, they came rocketing up from below, shattering the ice with their heads. If they aimed well, the blow sent their prey tumbling into the water, and the whales put their 4-inch-long teeth to work gathering dinner. "More villainous-looking creatures I have never seen," wrote Hurley after watching a couple of killers come up for a look at the Endurance. The men lived in fear that a killer whale might have trouble telling the difference between a seal and a human. After dinner on Saturday, May 1st, the officers of the Endurance said goodbye to the light. The next day, the sun disappeared below the horizon. It wouldn't make another appearance for 3.5 months. For a week or so, the temperature failed to rise above zero. Some mornings, the dogs had to be hacked out of the ice because their body heat melted the snow during the night and the water froze around them. The Antarctic winter had begun, and the cold wasn't the only thing to fear. 3.5 months without sunlight could make even the hardiest sailor begin to question his sanity. Anyone who doubted that fact had only to listen to the story of the Belgica. It was a tale that Shackleton knew well, and he didn't hesitate to tell it to the crew. In 1898, the Belgica became the first ship to winter below the Antarctic Circle. During her long, dark days stuck in the ice, a Belgian sailor died. The ship's officers gave him a burial at sea, sliding his body through a hole in the ice. The image haunted the men, their shipmate disappearing into the frigid waters. In the eerie half-light, they became convinced the dead man's body was following the ship, drifting beneath the ice. "We are under the spell of the black Antarctic night," wrote Frederick Cook, an American explorer on board, "and like the world which it darkens, we are cold, cheerless, and inactive." As the dark days dragged on, the men sunk deeper into gloom. They heard the dead sailor's ghost in the creaks and groans of the Belgica's timbers. After a while, the ship's cat seemed to lose its will to live. One day, it curled up in a corner and died. With their lone predator gone, rats came out of the woodwork and ran wild. The sailors stuffed cloth in their ears, but the muffled sound of little claws on wood still tormented them through the night. Eventually, 2 men grew so agitated they had to be restrained. The sailors of the Belgica were saved by the return of the sun and by long hours of back-breaking labor. In January 1899, they hacked and sawed a 2,000-foot lead out of the ice. The Belgica sailed into open waters, and the crew returned to Europe, where the sun can be trusted to come up 365 days a year. With the Belgica in mind, Shackleton fought the winter blues with work, a strict routine, and fun. Every day, like clockwork, the men gathered in the Ritz for meals: breakfast at 9 a.m., lunch at 1 p.m., tea at 4 p.m., and dinner at 6 p.m. Worsley once came in from a ski a few minutes late for lunch. He heard about it from the boss. At first, the men ate well. Shackleton made sure of it. There might be porridge, liver, and bacon for breakfast, a seal stew the sailors called hoosh for lunch, and seal steak for dinner with blackcurrant tart for dessert. Lees fretted over how fast the food was disappearing, but Shackleton insisted. A well-fed crew was a happy crew. Lees consoled himself by keeping a close eye on the supplies. He made sure he had a bunk near the storeroom door so he could pounce on thieves looking for a midnight snack. At night, the Ritz became a clubhouse with a regular entertainment schedule. On Saturdays, they drank and remembered their loved ones at home. On Sunday nights, they listened to music on the phonograph while they went to bed. Sometimes the meteorologist Hussey led sing-alongs on his banjo. They held competitions to see who had the most annoying voice. "It is astounding the musical talent we do not possess," Hurley observed. And there they are in the Ritz, working on their projects and stuff, staying busy. During the dark winter days, the scientists and the officers read books and debated important topics. Many a dispute ended with one party digging out a volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica to get a higher authority on his side. They're citing a source, the encyclopedia. But for all the knowledge the encyclopedia contained, it offered nothing on the most important subject of all, the war. Everyone aboard was desperate to know if their friends and family were safe from the fighting. All they could do was sit around a map of the world, make wild guesses, and plan imaginary battles by the light of an oil lamp. June was a cruel month at the bottom of the world. The men kept close watch on their position in the ice, but it only reminded them how helpless they were. Their hope was to drift north toward the edge of the giant swirling pack of ice, where they might finally find open seas again. On June 8th, they managed to make a little headway. "We have drifted 12 miles nearer home, and the Lord be thanked for that much, as I am about sick of the whole thing," McNish grumbled to his diary that night. As winter set in, the animals on the pack ice disappeared. Worsley kept watch for a lone penguin or seal as best he could in the dim light. Night after night, he recorded the results. No animal life observed. The entire landscape was dead, except for the dogs. Back in February, when it became clear they were going nowhere for the winter, Shackleton had divided the dogs into teams for training with the sleds. Wild, Hurley, the artist Marston, the doctors Macklin and James McElroy, and the rugged second officer Tom Crean each got a team. The dogs were unruly and always entertaining. They became a spark of light in the darkness. Unruly and entertaining. Like Miss Lucy. Crean had been a devoted dad to a litter of puppies since January. He was a big, burly Irishman who had been at sea since the age of 16 and survived 2 trips to the Antarctic already. But when the pups were born, he couldn't resist them. It wasn't unusual to find Crean with his pipe clenched between his teeth and his brawny arms wrapped around a couple of balls of fluff. The puppies got so attached to him that they wailed whenever he left and calmed down as soon as he came back. Crean and the other dog owners treated their teams like spoiled children. They snuck extra food to their dogs and praised them to anyone who would listen. Each owner knew for a fact that his team was smarter and faster than the rest. And there's Crean with some of the balls of fluff. On June 14th, a debate broke out at lunch. Hurley, the proudest of the dog owners, insisted his team was far and away the fastest. His team leader, a giant sheepdog mix named Shakespeare, was a magnificent animal, a noble creature. With Shakespeare in command, Hurley boasted, no team could measure up to his. The next day, he got a chance to prove it. In the dead darkness of winter, the entire crew gathered on the ice for the Great Antarctic Derby. A few of the sailors dressed as bookies and took bets. Worsley wagered his week's ration of chocolate on Wild and his team leader, Soldier. The geologist, Wordy, put his ration on Hurley and the noble Shakespeare. The teams started a half a mile away and raced one at a time against the clock. A line of oil lamps marked the path to the finish line near the ship. Shackleton started each team with a flash of a light. Worsley gave the play-by-play in his diary. Somewhere in the crowd, a pup yelps. A scientist swears. But presently, the cry of, "Here they come!" is raised, and something is seen moving swiftly ahead. Wild yells again, and the pace becomes terrific. Soldier, crouching low, head stretched forward and ears flapping in the breeze, dashes past the post in fine style. 2 minutes, 16 seconds from the start. The performance was enough to make Wild the winner. Hurley had to eat his words for now. He took second and insisted on a rematch. The true winner, however, was Shackleton. For one day, he had brought his 27 men together, made them care about something, and given them a temporary victory over the coldest, darkest place on Earth. A month later, the Antarctic began to take its revenge. On Wednesday, July 14th, the men woke to the sound of a gale screaming in the ship's rigging. The temperature plummeted to minus 33 degrees. Blinding curtains of snow raked the ship all day and into the night. Winds tore across the ice at 60 to 70 miles an hour. To feed the dogs, the men had to crawl to the dog loos. If they stood up, the wind knocked them down like they were made of straw. The next day, the blizzard let up enough for the crew to survey the damage. Drifts of snow had climbed 14 feet to the ship's gunwales. The dog loos on the port side lay buried under 5 feet of powder. The men covered every inch of skin and waddled into the wind to dig their beloved dogs out. At the height of the blizzard, Shackleton, Wild, and Captain Worsley gathered in the boss's cabin. The wind sounded to Worsley like a train racing through the room at top speed. In the early hours of the morning, the ship had taken an unnerving jolt from below. Shackleton had told McNish it was probably a whale giving the hull a friendly nudge. But the boss knew what it really meant. It was the ice, beginning to test the walls of the Endurance. With the crew, Shackleton always tried to stay positive. But Wild and Worsley were his two most important officers. He could be honest with them. The boss paced the room with his shoulders hunched and his hands behind his back. Worsley recognized the posture. He knew there was bad news to come. "She's pretty near her end," Shackleton said. "You mean that the ship will go?" Worsley asked. "I do," Shackleton responded. Worsley refused to believe it. The ship had held up so far, and he couldn't imagine things getting worse than they had been for the last couple of months. "You seriously mean to tell me the ship is doomed?" he said. And that was exactly what Shackleton meant. "It may be a few months, it may be only a question of weeks, or even days," the boss said. "But what the ice gets, the ice keeps." keeps. Chapter 6. Evicted. The sun came back, and it brightened more than just the sky. In the middle of August, 5 hours of real light shone on the crew every day. The ship drifted north at a good pace. By the end of the month, they'd moved 300 miles closer to civilization. As the weather warmed and the ship edged towards open water, the men started to think that the expedition wasn't dead after all. If the pack broke up soon, they could go back to Buenos Aires or South Georgia for provisions. Then they could make another run for Vassal Bay. At night, in the Ritz, they guessed at the date they would finally break out of the ice. McElroy put his money on November 3rd. Lees, who could be counted on to see the worst in a good situation, bet they'd be stuck until mid-February. Shackleton, always the optimist, claimed they'd be out by October 2nd. The ice had given them a scare at the beginning of August. The floes shifted and squeezed together, rocking the ship and turning the dogloos into powder. Now, at times, they could hear the sea ice, restless in the distance. They struggled to describe the sounds, to relate the groaning and roaring to something they knew. It was like traffic in the streets of London. It was a giant train with squeaking axles straining across the ice. Throw in steam whistles and roosters crowing. Under it all, Worsley heard the moans and groans of souls in torment. But near the end of September, life returned to the ice. Wordie saw an emperor penguin and lured it out of the water. The next day, Wild shot their first seal in 5 months. On September 29th, 2 petrels rode the air currents over the ship. Since petrels feed in the sea, Lees observed, open water couldn't be far away. "My birthday," McNish recorded that day, "and I sincerely hope to spend my next one at home." Spring fever was working its way through the drafty passageways of the Endurance. They'd been on board more than a year and hadn't seen open water since January. Now, long cracks split the ice floes around the ship. Leads of dark water striped the vast canvas of white. Shackleton decided it was time to move from the Ritz back on deck to their summer cabins. McNish, who was convinced they would be sailing again any day now, got to work putting bunks back in the old quarters. "The ship reverberates with hammers, sawing, cheers, and song," Hurley wrote on October 12th. 2 days later, the ice split beneath the ship, and for the first time in 8 months, they sailed through 100 yards of open water. It would be the final voyage of the Endurance. And there are the men getting snow and ice ready to melt for water. At 4 p.m. on October 18th, the officers and scientists were drinking tea below decks when they felt the ice nudging the hull of the ship. It was enough to send the men ambling on deck to see what was happening. As soon as they emerged, all hell broke loose. A wall of ice climbed the starboard side of the ship. The deck lurched underfoot and pitched to one side. In 5 seconds, the Endurance tilted 30 degrees to port, and everything that wasn't nailed down started to slide. Kennels, sleds, crates, lumber, and men careened down the deck. James, the physicist, landed under 2 crates of clothing with a mass of frightening dogs howling on top. Worsley stopped himself at the side of the ship. Worsley stopped himself at the side of the ship and leaned out over the edge. He watched the port side of the hull. He watched as the port side of the hull sank, inch by inch, into the ice. Just when it seemed the ship would roll onto her side and give in, all movement stopped. The ship's captain brimmed with pride. "She seemed to say to the grinding, hungry pack, You may smash me, but I'm damned if I'll go over another inch for you. I'll see you melting in hell first." The men spent the next 2 hours cleaning up as best they could. They nailed boards to the deck so they could walk without sliding into the mess jammed against the port gunwales. Then they liberated the dogs from the pile of kennels and secured the gear that hadn't already moved. When everything on deck had been stabilized, the crew gathered in the wardroom for a meal. Hurley managed to get a laugh out of the seating arrangement. Everyone sat on the floor with their feet jammed against freshly nailed boards. They balanced their food on their knees. Occasionally, someone would forget their predicament, put a plate down on the floor, and watch it careen into the port sidewall. At 9 p.m., the ice shifted. The ship righted itself, and the men were once again walking on level ground. The next day, a killer whale, almost as big as a bus, surfaced in the tiny pool around the ship. All evening, the sleek predator swam from one end of the pool to the other. It poked its head above water, disappeared, and then rose again. "He was a cruel-looking, shark-like beast, quite capable of swallowing one of us at a single gulp," Lees wrote. And they could no longer count on the ship for protection. Okay, and that's where we're going to end here. Lots of stuff happening. Lots and lots. Kind of scary. We'll be back next time with some more from the book.